Hello there. Welcome back to the streams. What seemed to be a regular feature going forward. Excited to restart this again. Um, Still figuring things out. Still have a couple of minor technical things that aren't 100% perfect, and it's not the setup that I used to have, but we're building. I would like to welcome in today's guest, one Derek Murray, who's going to be joining us to talk about defense scheme and no middle. Derek, how are you doing this evening?
PD, appreciate you having me. What's going on, everybody? Thanks for jumping in. Excited to talk about some basketball.
As usual in the chat, just let me know as we're filing in if the audio is particularly borked, so that way I can try to make any light adjustments as needed. As always, it's an adventure. I don't claim to be an audio engineer, nor would anyone ever accuse me of it, but I think that this one's going to be okay. Before we really jump over, can I just get a confirmation in the chat that things are like fine-ish, fine adjacent? Okay, Twitter DM says that things are okay, so let us jump in to our material today. What we're going to be talking about is no middle. It is a topic that is pretty essential for the 2023 draft cycle, and just given its prevalence in college basketball specifically, and how it evaluates. And I think that this is a really important opportunity to talk about how we actually use scheme to determine, what we're looking for when we scout. And it's great to have Derek here. It's great to talk about, and a way for any person to understand how scheme works, how we can look at roles within it, and also find the right, for people who may not have been, raised within basketball or really have the background but want to learn X's and O's, to have the opportunity to find their own on-ramp. Derek, I'd like to ask what your experiences have been in terms of learning X and O's, and when did you start to feel comfortable with, IDing what you were seeing on the fly?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it came from playing, but even then, as a young guy, when playing, understanding what to do, where to be, and the feel for it on the court is different than actually drawing it and reviewing film. So it probably wasn't until I was actually out of school that it became something important of okay, when I actually sit down and look at the film here, actually see plans, intentions, that you realize stuff of, oh, now I understand what my coach was telling me all those years ago and wanted me to do X, Y, and Z. So it's probably even after school that I got into the actual being able to zoom out, kind of like a macro view, and actually look at what was going on and the intent of things that I was told and taught to do when I was younger.
Yeah, I think that I had some ideas of scheme, but I never really knew how to extrapolate from scheme outwards. I think that I suffered from the problem of being a person who only ID'd scheme and not really gave players enough credit for what they were doing within it. So if a person made a play and they broke scheme, it would be a thing I dwelt upon, to be oh, they didn't do their job. And I think as I've gotten more mature in my own scouting, really taking the time to appreciate that there is a dynamic at play here between doing your job and making plays defensively. So with that, we have a nice little jump in and out. I'm still figuring out where my jump buttons are in terms of how long they are. So I guess the first question is what the hell is scheme? When we say scheme, what does that mean? What does it mean to identify it, and how can it be used in broad evaluation? And I think this is a pretty safe conversation, mostly because it feels very basic in a dumb way. I mean, defense, broadly speaking, is a Rube Goldberg machine. It's a lot of stuff to do something really simple, and that people who I think are X's and O's purists will tell you that you have to understand every little detail to understand scheme, and you have to really understand every detail. You're not seeing real basketball, or not seeing the high level chess match. And I don't particularly buy into that. I think that there are a lot of different entry points to scheme, and that viewpoint is ultimately selling a version of basketball, and a designed experience to people. But ultimately, I think that there are levels for everyone in terms of like knowing what is scheme, being able to call out its goals, and being able to understand what it is without having to know like every single school of it, or being able to diagram every single wrinkle. Does this line up with your experience at all?
Yes, it does. I mean, yeah, there's a big difference between general things and like the actual nitty gritty. It can be complex, but kind of like the slide says, like again, it's about the purpose and it's about getting the intent and purpose of what we're doing across to the players, that whatever that looks like. And a lot of players learn differently too, like different styles. So even if you have regardless of whether have you a simple or difficult scheme and system, like not every kid's going to learn it the same and absorb it as quickly. So that's like really interesting too, like the execution part where, it's kind of important who's on your team and their role in it, because not everybody's going to pick it up the same, and that's okay. But it's a wrinkle that makes it more difficult sometimes.
Yeah. And with that difficulty, people can, infer things they're not supposed to. And it definitely leads to a feeling of exclusion. I think that like a great example is like, I idolize this game. I've probably watched it more than any game ever in doing this, just because of how long I worked on this piece. But this Trae Young game is a great example of like how scheme can work and also when scheme can fail. So like here we're going to get into no middle, which is both very complicated in what it does and also very simple in that it does what it says. Like it is quite literally just like, hey man, the ball can never go middle. And in watching Trae play these games, there's so many ways where you could see him try to figure out ways to break this relatively new scheme, and also like what happens when the scheme does break and how simple it breaks, and how like it's designed to a purpose. And just like Rube Goldberg machines, like if one little thing breaks, it falls apart really quickly. But also you can see that like it's a complex machine of whirring and moving parts where it helps over really quickly and so much is happening, but at the same time when little things are done incorrectly, it just breaks. Like here we have a back cut and boom, it ends up in a layup. And it doesn't feel like both things should be possible, but it should be like so many moving parts that are really complicated, and also a thing that can be like really simple. And that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of like how to talk about this. Is sorry, I'm just figuring out how big my skips are. It's 10 seconds for what it's worth, Eric. So we can see that like, yes, there's a, help the helper and people going over and zoning up on the weak side, which we'll all talk about, but it's also a thing that can be with like a simple help cut at a certain angle. And that feels really like a really nuanced thing, but is actually as simple as like all of these things have really basic rules, and enforcing them is the hard part, but the rules themselves are very simple. So the question is like, if this is based on just a simple rule, if there are these things, like how do you know that? How do you diagram an ideology? And I think that's a very serious question, because a lot of diagrams that you see like don't really infer what's happening. So I just grabbed a whole bunch of different ways of diagramming, and also a picture of Zlatko Žižek as Luka Doncic. And as you can see from these, like there's a lot of things happening, but it's not really these are the hard and fast rules of the scheme. And occasionally you get that, like this one says no and yes, where it's like don't go middle, go to the sides. But just having these operating definitions similar to like when you're first driving a car, or learning any system, is you don't learn, you learn the rules and then you slowly learn how to break them. You don't just like learn little fun facts about driving. And a lot of times the learning X and O's, you feel like you get the opposite experience where you learn little bits like, oh, this is horns. Like when is horns to be used? What are we looking for? And developing a broad system that then gets narrower in terms of teaching people X and O's and their on ramp to it is something that like I think is extremely important as we go forward.
And that's why like it's impressive when a really young guy can come in and pick it up so quickly, because a lot of it is learning by doing. And learning by making wrong decisions and like picking it up piece by piece. When you have a kid who comes in and just gets it, that's when it's like really impressive.
Yeah. And because you do want to overthink, which we will very much talk about as we go through some of these examples. So what is no middle ideology? We'll get there in the most part in the piece. I say like it's never, ever, ever allow middle. You have to push ball handlers away from the middle. once you push them in the middle, things can be easier because you've eliminated half the options. So you're going to go towards the middle or towards the baseline. You push them towards the baseline. The phrase "no middle" is a scouting report, a guidebook, and a help side philosophy all in one. The scheme does a whole bunch of things, in terms of like how that all works. But it's right on the label, no middle. And when other schemes work this way too, other schemes are as simple as this. They're just not as clear about what they want. So like blitz schemes have like singular rules, but they're just not called the rule. And I think no middle, in being a complex scheme to do something very simple, is a really good starting point because it's a template that can be used to push forward into other areas. So I sat down with a mutual friend of ours who's a coach and wanted to play a game. And we were talking about how to ID schemes, and I kind of pitched the idea of like, in 10 questions, could you mentally picture like a famous basketball coach's scheme, what they're really known for, and in 10 yes or no questions, you're not using any jargon or things that are not like clear or couldn't be observed by like an AI or whatever. Could you get there? And it was maybe one of the hardest things I've ever done, just because like it's not just using terms like, oh, do we go with the wing or the slot or whatever. It's trying to find the way, like a boiled down version that's worth the question. And we did this back and forth for about an hour, and didn't do very well. It ends up being like jargon is a bit of a crutch for not thinking about how schemes work, but it did move us down a much farther, more helpful thing, which is to say, okay, how many questions do you think that we could ask if we were just putting jargon back on the table that would get us to what does a scheme do? Sort of like a four agreement style, like how small can we get? And we did eventually narrow down. I think that it could still use some more work, unlike this graphic, which is perfect in every single way. I'm very proud of it. And the first question is, what are the areas of the floor that the defense is most committed to taking away? Again, for no middle, this is very clear, but for areas like blitz, or for schemes like blitz, like ice, these are slightly more, nuanced, but it is still a direct question that can, determine whether it's a full court press, whether it is a zone. A 2-3 doesn't want you to get the ball at the high post, where, an ice heavy scheme isn't necessarily like in love. They don't love you to get the ball in the high post, but they're not, it doesn't destroy things. The next question that we have is which shots are defensive wins? And obviously like wide open threes and layups are, points per possession havens, but every scheme has a thing that is a bad possession because to get there was a problem. And this varies scheme by scheme. I was listening to a wonderful podcast with Will Wade where he was talking about there are certain types of threes that are good threes for us in his last year at LSU. And it was about, hey, this is the closeout angle, or this is the right guy shooting it, or it's so early in the shot clock that the guy getting it is probably going to hoist up some garbage, which allows us to press faster. And like those are not necessarily shot like you're not looking at it and seeing like, oh, slot three, great shot, when you're just looking at it broadly. But in the context of the game, there are wins available that the team is excited about. Like, yes, I'm so thrilled for that. Question 3. Where does this defense try to make things happen or make things not happen? Again, a little bit broad, but there are sort of the trigger areas of the defense. For blitz schemes, it's above the level of the screen, hip to hip, to make sure that there's not a slip or a split. For teams that are heavy sagging, you're making sure that like under no circumstances does somebody get running a direct line to the rim. These are the non-negotiables, but these are sort of the hot areas where they are the focus of drills. They are the focus of the defense. They are the areas where the scheme itself is as a chain of actions the weakest. And then our final one is, where do mathematical overloads most often happen? This is the idea that like there's offensive and defensive overloads. we're looking at this from a defensive perspective. So like, where are the areas where you're going to be weakest, where you know that the worst decisions are going to happen for your defense? Then where are the areas where you are strongest? Where can you funnel? Where are you pushing? Where are the places where the offense is at a natural disadvantage? Derek, do these 4 questions make sense as a framework to think about how to divide defenses?
They do, and they should, or else they could for anybody, like even in the simplest terms, because they allow you to draw the floor like a map, let you like zone things out. And it's especially the last couple, it's like, where do I want things to happen? Where do I not want things to happen? And then where can I have an overload? So if, like even just like a bird's eye view of the court mentally, if you're on the floor, you have a feel for, I do or don't want things to happen here. And then this is where I want to cause problems. So like looking at it from that point of view, again, just breaking up the court mentally in zones as like, I believe is the triangle graphic coming soon. I don't think we've shown it yet. But again, like for no, like I think that is like a good way to keep it simple, because these can be answered very quickly. And during a play, as soon as an action is created or something has happened, there's an event, like whether or not a rule's been broken, like instantly the answer to the question and then what you need to do off of that. So it allows you to do things really quickly.
Yeah. So I was thinking that we could go through these 4 questions for no middle to sort of show how this would work. But again, you could do this with any scheme. You could do this with, the Project 6-8 for the Raptors. You could do this with any base defense that a team deploys. Obviously, for each individual type of defense or jump defense or whatever, it has its own one. But I'm just thinking in terms of base, the things that teams do most common and most effectively. So for our first question, what areas of the floor is the defense most committed to taking away? And that's to keep the ball on one side of the floor and then force to the baseline. These are just a quick compilation of graphics. I wanted to turn these streams around quickly to make them relevant and not retweet the same article forever and ever. So just went and grabbed 3 quick examples of what we're looking for in terms of keeping the ball on one side of the floor. We have this triangle graphic, which is pretty common for most types of defenses. No middle takes it one step further and like throws automatic help when you go to the baseline. So you want to keep the ball out of the middle. And when you drive baseline away from the middle, there's automatic rotating help meeting in sort of this like T along the baseline. It's like sort of an auto double with the weak side zoning up. And this is how we're going to get our mathematical overloads. But when we say no middle, we mean push it out the middle like crazy. And there's automatically help going to be waiting for you once you push them baseline. Okay. Next, what shots are defensive wins? Shots that come out of the scramble, which is, after the zone up on the weak side, or by flattening away from the middle. So once you have pushed people away, if they're taking a floater, knowing that there's a person ready to take a charge there underneath, that's a good shot because your defense is already activated. So basically, shots that go into the teeth of the defense, where the defense is already rotating and ready to go, and then. Like with any defense that's based on rotations, you want the later possession goes into the clock, the worst points per possession. This isn't to say that these are against the standard rules. Like obviously contested, mid-rangers are great. Wide open layups are not good for a defense. This just means in addition to the normal ones. In addition to the normal stuff, like a 12-foot baseline floater, pretty good for everybody. But if your offense is driving baseline floaters in no middle, like every possession, then you're going to win this game by hella points. Where does this defense try to make things happen? I don't know if I've said this before, but not to the middle. Guys, it can't happen to the middle. This is why sometimes players pick this up really quickly. It's because they can internalize that it is truly that simple.
I'm saying it's very literally that simple. Just don't let them in there.
And I think this is also one of the challenges of evaluating no middle is that if this hasn't been drilled into you as an evaluator, you can be like, man, he really let that guy go baseline. But that's the goal. That's doing his job. And it can feel like I was raised in a push middle scheme. And the first time I saw no middle, I'm like, this is terrible defense. And I definitely the person was doing their job. I had such opinions about how defense should be run that it clouded my own judgment because I didn't understand super what was happening. As always, shout Go ahead.
It's hard to like unwire what you've done for a long time too, at any level. So like, even if somebody listening has had trouble with that, or maybe watches this and realizes like, oh wow, I guess I never really realized I assumed these things because I would play ball and was coached, X, Y, Z. Like that's okay. Sometimes
That's natural.
Realize it.
Yeah, we are the experiences that we've had, and I think that the purpose of this exercise for me is to sort of at least write those down, so that if rather than being internal assumptions, to externalize them, be like, okay, so I'm assuming that people wouldn't want you to just get a free run at the baseline. Is that correct? In this instance, one weird trick. No, it's not. As always, shout out to Jordan Sperber, his work. That's where the podcast with Wade was. And I used both every time you Google No Middle, his like videos are the first thing that come up. I can't recommend them enough. It's a great visual style. It's really helpful stuff. I use a couple of the screenshots. I'm not a person who feels that I can't credit people. So yeah, that's where I got these from. I tried to include the source if possible, so that people could track down should they need. And then when mathematical overloads, when do mathematical overloads happen most often? When or where? I'm not sure which one is the better phrasing. We're going to use two examples, offensively and defensively. Defensively, it helps when someone helps over from that baseline. And you get these like sort of weird one on three where the ball is being pressured and everybody else is zoned up on the weak side, which means that offensively there is one guy covering two people. For the purposes of this, we'll use sort of like a radial. It's the radial where one defender will be covering two guys. So it is a 2-on-1 in that small instance, but it's a 1-on-2 on the ball, so that people are less likely to make good decisions. So on the ball 2-on-1, and then everywhere else it's 3v4, and that seems like that seems like a little bit of an advantage for the offense, but only if they're really good in playing out of those situations. But you'll find that No Middle teams is like they are the best in the scramble. That is what they want, is to be in rotation, because they have more experience in rotation than you do, and the odds are that like most. And this I may be making some terrible presuppositions here, but what you don't want in life is like 18 to 22-year-olds making rash decisions filled with adrenaline, and facing a 3-on-4 in a crowded arena where it's like people are sprinting around. You just have to like really quickly decide. Generally, it's bad things, and that's partially why No Middle has been successful, is that it relies on smart, snappy decision making from players, moment to moment, reading a downhill defensive line around that's very prepared for that. So with these bits, we can ask, like, I think that's the next slide. I could be wrong, but don't quite have my key tabs figured out yet here. Okay, yeah. What does it mean to play well within the expectations of the role, within the scheme, and what can be extrapolated? So we have to ask, now that we know what the scheme wants to do, now we've asked these important questions. What can we take away from it? And now that requires sort of, adjudicating what the scheme wants, what the player you're watching, usually when, anyone scouts are looking at one particular player, or for our purposes, we'll look at two, just because they're both NBA guys. But the guy who's defending the ball, off ball, and the scheme. And this sort of becomes the holy trinity of defense. And this allows us to see what is happening here. It allows us to think about, what is happening here? What can we assume from the player? What can we assume from the help side? And how do we adjudicate whose responsibility is what? And this is really important when dealing with schemes, because like the more successful a scheme is, the more talent it gets, the more NBA players it gets. My focus is always going to be on scouting players for the NBA draft. And weird things happen when people go through schemes, because schemes can become trends. And Syracuse had a 2-3 zone that was extraordinarily successful and then fell out of favor. And there's sort of this line between 2017, like it becomes really popular, and its players become in vogue. There's sort of an overhyping of its guys, where like the stock rate isn't super well understood. And then there's a backlash against that when some of the guys don't work out. And I'm not here to do the like, well, this guy in a different spot or whatever, but it's just that's what happened. Suddenly 2-3 guys were not particularly popular. So that way, when Matisse, Beef Stew, and J-Mac went through specifically as like the 3 more successful guys, they were downplayed as products of a system and not actually properly evaluated.
Very, very heavily. Like all three of those guys defensively were, I think, especially Stu and J Mac. Like Matisse was, I think there was some inkling out there like this kid was like the real deal defensively, but he's still underplayed. But Stewart and Mac, like for sure, is like, talking to team scouts, whatever, evaluators, whoever, NBA, non NBA, and it's like, dog, these guys can play defense. Like these guys can play defense, and we've grown so accustomed to hearing how like we hate evaluating the zone that now that these guys are in it, no one cares. When they have a good game, it's because they played zone. When they have a bad game, it's because I told you so, because they're in a zone. And no one ever really like bought into like the talent they actually had.
Yeah, because I think that what ultimately came down is because people didn't, and I'm going to sort of cast some aspersions here, is that people didn't actually watch the clinics of the 2-3 zone. So they didn't know exactly, like when I did my JMac stuff, I tried to link out to like, hey, these are the plays that they want him to make. And these are the ones he is making. He's going above and beyond scheme rotations. And that isn't like I'm not saying like I was, right to have JMac higher or whatever. It's that like when it becomes when there's like a trend backlash, there's just a natural feeling of like, oh, I don't like all of this is kind of fraudulent, or all of this is proven not to work. And like the answer is just, it's never one thing. It's always a combination of things. And like if, one guy turns out a little bit differently, does that alter JMac stock? Does that alter T stock? Does that offer Stu stock? And that was not intentional. But that's, what we have to be aware of is the environment that these things happen in. And it always comes back to like, what is the scheme asking? Because if you are not in tune with what the scheme is asking, you're more likely to have those misses, and not to blame particular people. But the more that you just like say like, oh, the scheme is what it is, the less likely you're going to want to dive into that player's tape, because you're just like, oh, this is either a waste of my time or like a thing that's unknowable. And like neither of those are really true. I bring that up. Go ahead.
Opinions on, I love watching teams that play zone, or this is the worst day ever that I have to watch some zone. It does feel like people sway pretty far either direction.
Yeah, and I think that like, and for me personally, the tempo of zone bothers, like as a watching experience, is much worse. But like if the offense is very slow and they play zone, I'm less likely to like it, just because I don't really love down tempo teams, especially if you're like trying to create turnovers. Oftentimes these teams didn't necessarily have great point guards, and like I think that a lot of the things you can say about college basketball is like, if there's a good point guard, it becomes a lot more watchable. And this idea kind of leads us to no middle. And again, I'm not trying to draw this one-to-one comparison, but just that like no middle is now a trend. No middle is a thing that if you especially fill up on the Big 12, everybody is playing no middle. And to properly evaluate guys, like in the 22 classes we talk about, there are two guys that like I think were both a little bit weirdly evaluated because their own proclivities within this. And regardless of how the guys previously worked out, we do need to stare down the scheme, come to terms with the scheme, so that way we can properly evaluate the like 25 to 30 prospects, real prospects that are playing in no medals, because otherwise we risk the same thing of misevaluating or misapplying where their actual strengths and weaknesses lie.
Also want to go back. I want to mute for a second because I went and looked up Beef Stew and Jaden McDaniels DSI's pre-college. Shameless plug for the Cerebral Hoops database. Both these kids could play defense before we got to the zone.
Yeah.
So it's just stuff that like I think is like looking at McDaniel's numbers in here. DSI's last couple of months before college, 81, 85, 70, 101. Like and he's an 82 right now in the league. Like and Stu had the same kind of thing. Like it was there. They were just put into a system that some people they didn't want to read it correctly or couldn't. I'm not gonna trying to point fingers, but like it's a different. It is. It's different. But having those numbers pre-college is really important too.
Yeah. So instead of thinking about who's to blame necessarily, sort of dividing. I think that a better way of evaluating is thinking about like how much It's not something is the fault of the scheme, something is the fault of the help side, something is the fault of the point of attack defender. Is that like it's just a melange of all three, and that like there's varying levels for varying mistakes. So like just taking a random situation is just like a player drives baseline and gets a layup. Now, if the driver was to snake middle, that is a little bit more on the point of attack defender for not enforcing that driving angle. If the help is too shallow, as in like the angle enforced is the help over from the nail, or the help across the baseline is too shallow, like repeatedly, whether they're not just accounting for athleticism or think that a dude could jump better or whatever. That's more on the design of the scheme and the angles enforced there. Or if no help's arrives and he just like gets a walk to a dunk or whatever, that's clearly on help. But it's never just that. It's always a mixture of things. And if you were to say not be as in tune with what the expectations of the scheme are, you would always be a little bit wrong. And that those small elements do add up. And so even if it's not 100%, knowing every term and knowing the exact nature of the scheme, but just knowing where generally things are being asked to be is extraordinarily helpful. And I think over a long enough time, like this is all mutually reinforcing, but like as you start to get, more familiar with this stuff, it becomes a lot easier and becomes a lot more passive. And I think the best way to get familiar with it is to Fisk a game. And I wouldn't say a game, I would say like a small stretch. So Fisking is just writing down everything that happens for a smaller stretch. We're going to do about 7 minutes, or in the piece, I do about 7 minutes of this Alabama Baylor game, but I'm only doing one side of the floor. Generally, if you're doing both sides, I would say 2 to 4 minutes. I would just diagram everything out, write out every player, what's happening, why you think it's happening, for both sides of the ball. And this is just, it'll probably end up being like 6 possessions, 7 possessions, but it'll definitely give you a much better idea of, the moments where you're like, okay, so I don't know like what this dude is doing. And sometimes the answer is like, dude didn't know what he was doing. But it will, I think, lead to better questions. And so that was one of the ideas I wanted to demonstrate with this piece, was just a way that I personally got over the daunting feeling of how to continue with X and O's knowledge, because of being able to ask specific questions, being able to know where the lacuna in your knowledge is extraordinarily helpful. So I think we're doing 4 clips in the old style. We start with a nice horn set. They get an entry, and we're going to get sort of like a handoff thing. We see that Kendall is really close to the screen. He's ready to switch. Baylor generally is really aggressive at the point of attack, and they get a cross court skip. Now, when we get this cross court skip, we're going to see everybody rotate, and any guesses on which way the ball handler is going, which side they're going to take away? Are they going to take away middle or baseline? Derek Murray, which one do you think?
You're making it tough on me.
I would never give up middle shirt has some people asking questions already answered by the shirt. So Shaq is going to.
And this play, again, just right off the bat, this play is a great example. Like, there are some people who would see this and go, oh, he got beat baseline. So his job is to make sure that's exactly where he goes.
But
because he knows he's got 2-6-8 guys collapsing behind him. As long as everybody is doing their job, that is the plan.
But even still, you could give too shallow of an angle and he'd get too straight of a line. So the goal is to force him baseline, but to force him as wide baseline as possible. And so, like, even within giving him baseline, there's still levels and stuff. And far be it for me to take away my pedantic coach sensibilities. But like, even still, there are things to be worked on, even if you're just forcing a baseline. So we force baseline and we can see all 5 guys rotate. And now we have sort of this hammer thing that we've talked about where like there's a guy meeting him to take a charge. It's Sohan. And we can see Kendall Brown's responsibility. The block arrow is how I'm labeling responsibility. Kendall Brown is lurking in the middle. He's going to take JD. Top side has JQ all the way at the back. And our weak side defender has 2 responsibilities. So if the pass goes to either one of those guys, he is responsible for that next rotation. And this is how we get our advantage. You challenge the ball, make the pass hard, try to take a charge. And then the weak side guys is roving trying to figure out what happens. So just like we've talked about, we have our initial rule. Hey, we're going to push them this way. And then we're going to get into the systems that we've practiced a lot, which is pressure and recover. And like this is exactly what they want to play out of. It's really specific. You're trying to push the guard's responsibility, or the point of attack commander's responsibility is to walk him all the way down into Sohan. And Sohan's responsibility is to be there right before the paint, just outside the zone, or just outside of the restricted area, and take a charge or stop the ball or what have you. And everybody else pressurizes. JQ is going to retreat, keeps his dribble alive, kicks out, and now we're back to normal. We have a gamble, and we can see the second the gamble happens, things kind of break down, and the defensive solubility is lost. Just like the old way, we're going to watch everything twice. So we start in the horns, doesn't work, we get a get. We do the dribble handoff again. We can see how important pressure is to this. We don't want no middle doesn't want teams to have a lot of time to think. You want to keep them funneling them.
Cannot have time to think. Like, you've got to make every decision a problem, and you got to make it difficult.
Yep. And we can see right at the right as the closeout cross court, we can watch the feet get readjusted, because at first his feet are all stop it right. Now see how he's prepared to give away middle, and he'll flip his hips to say nope, and push him baseline. And like those are the little things where, like, in, you know, if JQ was really trying to, he could have pushed middle and broken the scheme, because there's, as we're going to talk about in future clips, when you get middle, there's not really a solution out of it. Like, there's not really a get back to the level, get back to defensive advantage numerically. Things just get really difficult. And we can see this sort of like help yourself when we watch Trey, because like Trey's such a good decision maker that when you watch this game, it seems like he's kind of playing this on easy mode, because the second that the second that a seam is revealed, as a person who's already internalized the scheme, like it takes him about a quarter of a second and he already has the lob out. Like, I'm going to freeze it here just to be like, this is an insanely fast one. The 12 has to be, rotating down to take away the lob, but a extremely high level processor is already ready. And in seeing how different people react to this, you kind of get a feeling for like what the scheme is trying to do. It's trying to make people make fast decisions, but for the elite decision makers, like, this isn't, there's solutions here. I cannot recommend watching this game enough. I mean, I think there's two of them, but it's like this one in particular is just classic stuff. Next possession, I think it's this possession 4 out of the 12. We're gonna get a screen reject. JQ's gonna set it up, and we get hard switch. Here we can see that the defender is taking away middle. The defensive back line all set, ready to go. Trying to funnel as needed. And the thing about Jersey guards is they all have just really nice handles, shift, and we get middle. And it poses the question of like, what do you do when you give up middle in no middle?
You scream help.
Yeah, the coaching literature just basically says you're fucked. Like, that's how the clinic's like, yeah, there's not much you can do. But like, let's game this one out. So like, JQ now has middle. What are you supposed to do to get that 2-on-1, that one guy covering 2 offensive players thing that no middle really wants? And there's not really a way to do it. So like, my first idea is like, you have the frontside guard sprint all the way across the court. You have Kendall step up. You have weak side corner help over, and Sohan has both the corner and like basically lane line extended as rotations, which is not optimal. As far as like a big rotation, it's a really easy pass. One of the keys of no middle is that you want the hardest pass possible guarded by 2 people. Like, that is the heuristic here, is to find like, okay, what's the hardest pass you can make? And like, ideally those are the angles being enforced. And when you go middle, like, where is this supposed to happen? Okay, hypothetically, you have the top side guy sprinting all the way down. You have Sohan helping over, Kendall stepping up, and now you have the weak side corner guarding both of the corner and the opposite side of the floor. And that opposite side of the floor is like a pass that like a 6th grader could make.
Did you put the screenshot of JQ under the basket where you're like, what pass do you want him to make?
No, I didn't do that in this one. Okay. And so here we can see what they actually do is everybody just stays home. Like, you just play the string out and say, look, force a tough shot. We're going to help a little bit off the hardest pass. and you kind of stay home. It gives up an and one, but nothing like it's not a scramble situation. It's just like we're screwed, batten down the hatches. And this is why no middle is so adamant about not being middle, is because the logic of the defense is based on like there being a way to create this defensive one guy covering two people, and there's no way to do that if you give up middle. So there's always going to be these digs. There's always going to be these angle enforcements, because again, it's all this complex stuff just to get a simple idea of like we need to have one person guarding two people to do all this pressure stuff. Here we start, and it's going to be a ghost screen into a flare, and Jakey's just going to attack. Here we can see that the corner's been given up, and we're barreling downhill, and so naturally, Sohan helps over to stop the ball. In this scheme, you have to help the helper, and if you don't help the helper, you give stuff up. So Kendall Brown is currently like what I would say is like roving. He's mentally trying to make the play. Trying to read the defender's eyes, and that's not what this is about. This is automatic. This has to be an automatic read, and that's why in this piece, and I think overall, I think Kendall Brown gets a very unfair rep in draft circles for him as a defender. He was really more just like what the scheme wanted out of him as a help side defender, and his proclivities and like where his skills weren't necessarily one-to-one matches. He's a person who's much more, I don't say freelancing, but like he does better in moments of
he's a little bit like a free safety, like a middle linebacker, a free safety football, like read and react, make a good play. Again, the guy with that kind of athleticism, size and athleticism, to an extent, you're used to being able to make the plays that you want to. So like that, I think played a huge part in like the adjustment.
And the thing about no middle is it doesn't want you to read or react. It wants you to do the scheme.
Yeah, either thing he wants to do.
Yeah, you don't have time to read. It is simply just react. There's no and here. So as Sohan helps over, he already needs to be down. He needs to have a passing angle. Baseline cutter goes, ball is already out, and there's a foul at the rim. But this is a situation that should have been an automatic. We saw with Trey, like when seams are exposed, they are. Like, but when the rules of the defense breakdown, seams are exposed, those seams are exposed, you can get really easy looks. And this is just a simple half second that exposes a seam, gives it up. When we look at the other angle, we can see, thank God for alternate angles, the best thing to happen to basketball. We can see that, again, he's not taking a straight line drive. This is not a particularly threatening drive. It's not 2 feet in the paint. It's just the fact that it is threatening enough means that the help has to be triggered, which means the help has to be triggered, which means that this entire cavalcade of things has to happen. And a small seam in that creates an opportunity. And so, we can see that just between those two guys, again, this is not an easy pass, but there is an opportunity there. And it leads to a foul and so on right at the rim. I mean, just quite literally a tiny window that a pass is being thrown into. When we see the third angle, you can, like, that's how small it is. That theoretically 2 dudes with their arms out, it probably makes like a 2-foot window that you have to throw on the run, under pressure, outside your body. Like, that's not an easy thing. It's not an easy decision to make on the fly. It's not an easy pass to make, and it's able to barely get a look that, Sohan is able to challenge. So even with these breakdowns, like, this is still so formidable, and it's still asking really serious questions. And Bama has some really great blusters for this concept, trying to challenge these reads, these automatic rotations by just a moment's hesitation, because that's all you really need at a game this fast. And here we can see the Trey and the exact same thing. This is a quicker, faster guard getting better penetration, and we can see exactly how quickly you need to make that decision. Defenders a quarter second late dump.
Shout out Jamani McNeese. Just want to drop that in there.
Appreciate that. All right, here's our final one from this game. That guy zoomed in for the replay. We're going to go with a pitch and chase that gets slipped. Kendall gets a little bit beat. So here we can see that we are hypothetically in the danger zone. That hypothetically, J.D. Davison could turn this corner, And we would be in a situation where there's no advantage available for the defense, where no player can take two offensive players and the scheme cannot be enforced. And Kendall Brown just turns it. He slides. He makes it so that there's no paint touch. And now Sohan can take two guys. So that small angle differential going from a semi-straight line drive that can result in paint touches to bumping a guard off their route. This is why I think that No Middle specifically recruits guys who are just better in the weight room, specifically in the lower body, is for this exact moment. Can you bump them off spots?
That's not easy to do without fouling against those crafty guys too.
Yeah, against SEC athletes. Like this is a very difficult defensive play, but we can see that like the scheme goes from panic mode to everything is operating in like basically a stride and a half. And to me, this is one of the more representative plays because like in this moment, things could be screwed. And in this moment, like it's really wavering in the balance. It's only Kendall being able to hold that line that we get, right back on script. And this is where the idea of like, what scheme are you evaluating for is super important. Because like, if we're going to punish him for the misses of the giving up the backdoor cut that leads to a Sohan foul, we also have to reward him for like, this is a play that is a scheme saving play. It gets them back on script. It totally turns this possession. And like those have to be sort of weighed as like one is a really scheme essential. The other one's obviously a scheme problem. Is this a scheme we would want him to run the pros? And like the answer is no. I would not, want him in this sort of a tighter scheme. I want him in a looser role where he can, feel things out. But we have a guy who is much better in the tight situations. So I'm giving a whole bunch of credit for executing scheme, and a guy who's much better in looser situations, trying to adapt and sort of not doing a particularly good job. And we can see how those two things impact stock. But it's also when we talk about it, we want to say, like, yes, Sohan picked the right school. He did a fantastic job. He's a exact fit for what they want him to do. I think this is the exact defensive scheme that we would want him to play in the pros, versus like he's a good defender. And like one isn't a good defender or a bad defender. They could obviously be different gradations, but it's that we want to be able to figure out what scheme is best for them and project that forward. And that comes from understanding the scheme in some part that they played and how it can suit their strengths and weaknesses. Or does that make sense so far?
Does to me. I hope it does for everybody else. Vote in the chat if it doesn't.
Okay, yell at me and tell me that I've thrown my life away to work on this for like 6 months if I'm wrong. So the goal of this project is to take this most, I would say, the year of No Middle in terms of prospects. Every other year we've had some good guys. This is a year where there's been so much adoption. A lot of those guys are pros and pros prospects. So we have to look at their defensive tape with this in mind. So when we see things like this, when we see, there's a show and is walking him down, it's not just, okay, that's what Ant was doing. It's like, okay, so then what's Nick's job here? What's Brazil's job here? And evaluating it within the expectations of what we've seen. So that way we may have slightly different takeaways. We may, there can still be a good or bad defensive play within the idea, but we just want to have a little bit different takeaway with these moments. Where it's like, okay, is this the ideal foot positioning? Is that bump what we're looking for? What are the weak side responsibilities? And now, again, just by those 4 ideas, crafting them on here and seeing, what we're looking for, maybe even asking better questions if we haven't quite internalized them, allows us to have different takeaways, allows us to have different evaluations, and maybe ask better questions in the way that we scout. These are early season clips. I am not inferring that anybody's doing a good or bad job. I don't personally find scrimmages to be positive or negative scouting material. I just used these because they were available and they were, current when I was clipping it together. But it was a chance to see, like, look, this is the early stages of Arkansas. What it's going to look like in December, what it's going to look like in February, what's going to look like in late March as their season winds down, is going to change. And that understanding this is both a process and a new scheme for them, and one that we've talked about has some peculiarities. Understanding that maybe instead of saying like, oh, is this guy a good or bad defender, was like, okay, so have you run a scheme like this before? What were your different, which one were you more comfortable in? And now we've gotten more granular without necessarily needing a ton more knowledge or anything, but just by observing these systemic differences and then putting those forward as ideas. And I think that's the goal here, is just to maybe have a more systemic view of evaluating defense without necessarily needing to, spend 18 million 100 hours in a film room, but just by asking simple questions. And because that's certainly how I've missed on guys. Lord knows. Okay. Any final thoughts or things you want to see again, Derek?
I think just for people who either are watching this or will later that want to look at guys in this draft class, what obviously like Baylor, Texas Tech, like Arkansas, what teams and or players would you tell people this concept is something that to keep in mind when you're watching, X teams or X players this year, just so they know kind of going in.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if they're in the Big 12, like if they're in the Big 12 or they play at Arkansas. I mean, a lot of teams will mix in concepts, and you'll start to notice that like teams will run ice stuff, and you can see that guys will be more or less comfortable with different stuff. The Champions Classic, Duke was really mixing up coverages, and like there were coverages that like Derek Lively was not comfortable with. And the question becomes like, is that particular coverage is not comfortable for him, or the idea of switching coverage is not comfortable for him?
Yeah.
And if we're asking that question, now we have a much better scout. Like now we're thinking about this slightly differently. So we see, hey, do I like the games where he is, play if it's a ton of hedges at a problem, or is it a hedge every fourth possession or every this type of lineup? So I think that it's not just what teams do this, because a bunch of teams that don't run it full time will try to mix in ideas or have games where they have busters, but it's also teams playing this. If a kid, we talk about Kansas is the other one I would really recommend for early viewings of no middle as it's being fully weaponized, is watching self kind of try new stuff against it. Oh, does this play work? Does that play work? And seeing if the first time somebody plays no middle, seeing if they're trying the same drive, seeing if they're trying the same processes as the second time. The goal in all of this is to ask better questions, but realistically, like you're not going to suddenly come to like, oh, this therefore means that this guy's a great defensive prospect. It's that ultimately what we are trying to find is a better process of scouting that leads us to asking better questions faster. And I think that knowing what schemes people run is already a huge step. If that's not something that you're doing, then like being able to get there is going to really help. Whether it's recognizing it, whether it is recognizing when someone's uncomfortable, like these are huge steps forward in someone's analysis, and also they're steps forward in the things that will come to you once you've started. Like these are their own road that I found to be tremendously comfortable for me. I think we can switch over and see if there's any Q&A. We have a couple people in here.
Cool.
It's a pretty busy night, but I'll bump over to the Q&A screen. We'll give it a couple minutes if anybody wants to ask. If not, we will just bullshit for a couple minutes and then get on out of here. If you have any questions, feel free to grab them. I'm going to fill up my water and be back in about 30 seconds. Be right back. All right, welcome back, everybody. Looks like we don't have too much in the questions department, so I think I'm just going to give like a quick rant since we're question light on who I think that has the most to prove that is currently playing in a no middle in terms of what what seeing from them would be most important. And I think the answer is Nick Smith.
Yeah, because the offense is so widely talked about. It's you can't. I mean, some guys can get away with being one-dimensional, one-sided, but yeah, he's the one on that team. Both from at least early on a physical strength side too. Like Walsh and Black, like they're strong kids. Nick's he's athletic, but being able to bump people off and without fouling and doing his job is going to be something to watch.
Yeah, and it's just for guys who do have huge creation burdens, it's really interesting to see how they handle like the quick thinking on defense. Like obviously it's chain reactions, but it's also just like you can't fall asleep in no middle because you always have to be like you can't miss a link. And that's just a lot to ask for a guy who like is a solid defender, but just hasn't played in a system where he's had to do both of those things. I think it's also why like generally there's not there's a smaller guards tend to do a little bit better here because once they get the rotations, they can kind of hang in. And it can be a way of I'd say hiding worse tooled defenders, but you have to get the concepts to play because like some guys really click into it, some guys don't, and it's much more about understanding what's being asked of you than it is necessarily about like the physical dimensions. Though him enforcing those driving angles is going to be super important because he is pretty high hipped. So that would be my answer. Albertius asks, are there common wrinkles within no middle concepts, alternative principles of some kind you need to consider when evaluating a decision? Maybe more so for teams that mix it into their coverages more than run it every possession. I don't think that there are the most common wrinkles are going to be like how teams handle ball screens. Whether it's hot switching, whether it is triangle switching, whether it is blitzing, which like not every team has the bigs to blitz. I think that those put different types of pressure on like bigs, especially with foul trouble. You just have to be so disciplined, which is why like the Miami Heat had such
you got to be careful.
Yeah. And not every team like just has 3 college picks they trust to like blitz and recover without fouling. And then like the other thing is that like teams that mix it in, those are like a very specific type of coach. Like having a base team, like it's because so much of this is drilled like really instinctively. It's really important to like there are very few coaches who will trust their team and trust their time spent because you only have so much time in college. By NCAA bylaw, that like they won't trust themselves to run it partially. Like it's sort of like having minimalism be your thing fashion wise, where like you kind of can't do it on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then like try something, just wear a t-shirt. Like either you're a Rick Owens guy every day of the year, or you're not. In terms of like college. So I would say that you're not going to find many teams that mix it up. But if you're talking from an NBA perspective, like you will find teams that have that are multiple. And for that, you just really need to have, if you're going to be multiple with a no middle concept like that, it's just a really, really, really disciplined big. So guys who are, I'd say on the toolsier side, probably wouldn't trust them as prospects to be able to do that. Derek, you have a final hypothetical to toss in here before we get out?
I don't think so. I think I'm good. I'm hoping this was really helpful for people. I mean, I think you covered a lot, and people who with coaching backgrounds or even just like amateur draft guys on Twitter who want to learn and maybe see guys differently. I think that they got a lot out of this. I think there was a lot good. And again, I will plug your 74-page Google Doc for those who listen to this. or watch this and have not read it, take the time. It was very, very in depth. You thought you got something from an hour of this, read that paper. So I thought it was good, but I think, yeah, hope it opens some people's eyes, and would love to hear from people afterward on, hey, I watched this game and noticed this, or rewatched some beef stew, just absolutely dominating some people in high school, and now I get it with this own thing at Washington. I think there's a lot to take away.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I mean, honestly, the feedback to it has been really overwhelming. This took a lot of time. This took a lot of putting other stuff to the side, and I feel like it's the feedback I've gotten from people that it has helped them, has really made it worthwhile. Because like when you've watched 50 middle games or whatever I watched for this piece, watching like hella clinics and just sinking in time where I'm like, I don't know if this is going to be worth it, or I'm just wasting what I do, wasting a day watching Bob Knight clinics or whatever. You just have worries, and I've just been so thankful for the feedback that I've gotten. If you spent the time with that, I know it's a lot of words. It's a lot of bullshit. I really appreciate you. I really appreciate everybody who helped out with it, whether it was with interviews or bouncing off paragraphs or whatever. And I really appreciate you, Derek, for sitting down and talking about this. If you're watching this after the fact, the link to that is in the index piece in my Twitter, where you can find everything that I write. If conversations with me and Derek are something that you would like to do more often, something that you'd like to sit in, believe it or not, Cerebro Sports is hiring, and would love to have anybody who has an interest in high school basketball, and wants to learn more about what we do in terms of our database and our scouting stuff. Tap in with that. You can find that at either my Twitter, his Twitter, or at the Cerebro Sports Twitter. I appreciate everybody who was live for this one, everyone who watched on replay. If you're just joining now, it'll be available on YouTube when it processes. Again, we're getting this stuff back up now that things are stable and good. I appreciate everybody, and have a good night, guys. It's great to be back.